This webinar will be hosted by Lisa J. Berry-Tayman and Jim McGann. Lisa is a trusted advisor and the founder of Information Consulting and provides assistance to organizations in the area of records and information management, privacy and information protection, information governance, and e-discovery. Jim is the Vice President of Marketing at Index Engines and has extensive experience with e-discovery and information management in the Fortune 2000 sector. He is a frequent writer and speaker on topics of big data, backup tape remediation, electronic discovery, and records management. Please type any questions for Lisa or Jim in the question area on the right of your screen, and they will answer them at the end of the webinar. So let's begin. Lisa?
Thank you, Jan. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. In this webinar, we're going to go over kind of three different areas. One of them is what's happening. What's going on? What are we seeing in terms of big data? And that's kind of our smoke. That's what we're seeing on the horizons. We're going to discuss why this big data is a problem. And that's the fire underneath. And last, we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about how we control that fire, or how we eliminate that fire, how we cut off its oxygen, and we make big data a little bit more controllable for us. On the next slide, there's just it's a great way of showing that there's just too much information for our organizations. In the last 5 years, it's more than doubled. Interestingly enough, I did some research this morning, and in the hour that we're talking, 2.5 exabytes of information and data will be created. And keep that number in your mind, 2.5 exabytes. In one day, 294 billion emails will be sent back and forth. Now, why is this happening? Why do we have all this information? And there's a lot of different reasons. Obviously, we've moved from the paper world to the electronic world. Many times when there aren't policies or procedures, by default, companies go to this keep everything. And no one wants to be that one person who throws something away. Many times, even if you do have a retention policy or disposition policy, there's not any instructions or procedures to show people how to actually do this. And there's no enforcement. No one goes back and audits. Nobody makes sure. It doesn't become a part of the company's culture. Also, what happens in many instances is companies, when they get involved with litigation, instead of telling their folks, this is the type of relevant information that we need to preserve in this litigation, companies, because they're not comfortable knowing where their information is or how to get to it, will just say, well, we'll be safe. We'll just keep everything. And after multiple litigations, that keep everything legal hold just continues on and on and on and on until there's this large bulk of data that people are unsure how to deal with. In the past, as you can see on the next slide, you could tell pretty quickly when there was a problem with somebody's information, when it had gotten out of control. You could see that they had some kind of system going and it just blew up on them. But now, many times, because all of 90% of our information is electronic, as you can see on the next slide, you can't tell. I mean, this line of servers looks very neat and clean. You have no idea what's really in there, what's full, what's not full, and therefore it's hard to keep that in perspective. Now, it's also really hard because we've in the electronic world, we've come into an entirely different terminology set. And because of that, it's hard to understand how much information is really being contained within these servers. In our next slide, we're going to show you a little bit of perspective on that. And what I want to do is, I really understand this when I correlate it to paper or to books. And so what I did some research, and I found that a megabyte, although it's one floppy disk, is also 4 books of about 200 pages. Therefore, 5 megabytes would have been the complete works of Shakespeare. A gigabyte, in 7 minutes of HD, is 4,473 books of 200 pages. Or if you want to speak in terms of something physical, it's paper in the bed of a pickup truck. A terabyte is 4,581,298 of these 200-page books. 2 terabytes would be an entire academic research library. A petabyte is 4,691,249,611 books. Or 2 petabytes would be all the U.S. academic research libraries. And an exabyte is 4,803,839,602,528 of those 200-page books. And remember, I said earlier, in this hour that we're talking, 2.5 exabytes are being created. So that's like, if my math is correct, is 10 trillion books. On the next slide, it shows the IDC did some research and found that in 2010, 1.8 zettabytes, which is even more than what we were talking about in the last slide, exists. So what is that? That's approximately 77 iPads stacked lengthwise for 5,000 miles. We are working our way into the yottabyte century, and no data has even been collected for that. To give you an idea of, in a kind of picturesque format of what that volume of data is. On the next slide, I'm going to show you some repositories today. As I said, we have all this data. That's one problem, but we also have all of these repositories. You have email servers, content servers, file servers, communication servers, laptops, desktops, backup tapes, CDs, DVDs, floppy disks, memory sticks, thumb drives, external hard drives. You have data on your phones, and now we have the cloud out there, which can contain tons and tons of information. So that's what we're dealing with today. That's the smoke. That's what we're seeing out there in the world. It's just more and more and more and more and more. So why is this a problem? Why is this a problem for your organization? And that's kind of the next slide that leads us into the next section. Why is this a fire underneath all that smoke, and why is it something that needs to be contained? Well, first of all, we've all been told that storage is cheap, and I'm going to debunk that myth here. Storage is not cheap. The hardware for storage has gone down drastically over the years, and perhaps you could categorize it as cheap. But that's only 20% of the whole. You have to factor in the other 80%, and I put that into a kind of a wordle, but I'm going to read some of these things to you that you have to calculate in when you're dealing with storage. Obviously you've got hardware and software, but you have to deal with staff salaries, power consumption, cooling, monitoring, floor space, duplicate data costs, outage costs, both scheduled and unscheduled, all kinds of backup infrastructure, plus the media, storage area networking, security, encryption, and you have a lot of people that go through all the procurement of these items as well. So about a $100,000 storage decision that you make could actually cost your organization more than $1 million a year. So storage is not cheap when you factor all of this stuff in. In actuality, if we go to the next slide, I wanted to find out what the total cost of storage was. And that's not an easy figure to come up with because every organization is a little bit different. So what I did is there's some other information out on the internet, some other people's guesstimates about what a gigabyte costs per year. And then I did a lot of reading on sites for IT people who were also trying to come up with their own cost of storage. And these folks are from a variety of different organizations, big organizations, small organizations, not-for-profits, for-profits, and they were kind of all talking together. So what I did was I took all of that information that I could find, and I did a simple average. And what I came up with is that a gigabyte of data per year cost $171. Now, I have seen some figures since then that are showing that that a gigabyte per year costs between $50 or $60. But I think that is for larger organizations. And again, like I said, the research that I did was based on organizations of all different sizes. I think in many instances, the smaller your organization is, the higher your cost per gigabyte can be. So somewhere between, 50 or 60 to $171 per gigabyte. So in terms of storage, if you can get rid of a gigabyte, or let's go even higher than that, let's say we're getting rid of a petabyte, you could save your company $171,000 a year. Let's say you go even more drastic, you have a big vision and you want to get rid of a petabyte. That's $171 million a year. And we're talking real money here. So contrary to popular belief, for what I do in records and information management and information governance, there can be a return on investment. Another area that we have to talk about when we're talking about the fire that this data can be for organizations, and it's on the next slide, is e-discovery. And many of you probably heard this term thrown around many, many times. I'm going to go ahead and give like a brief explanation in case it just happens to be a new term or a term that you've thrown around but perhaps maybe you didn't quite understand. In litigation, there's a time in which the disputing parties turn over relevant, non-privileged information to the other. And that depends upon whether you're in state and federal court, when that timing is. But when that information is turned over, that's a process called discovery. And in the past, we've turned over boxes and boxes of papers to each other. Or in some instances, you were actually allowed to go into their warehouse where they kept all these boxes and to sort through them yourself. But now, as I said earlier, when most of our information is electronic, that information is stored on computers. So when you want to get to that electronically stored information, you have to do so in a very different way than we did in paper. And so the term has evolved into electronic discovery or e-discovery. And as you're going to see on the next slide, e-discovery can be very difficult because of the same reason we talked about earlier. Where's relevant information? It could be anywhere in all of those areas that I described to you earlier. It could be in file shares, it could be in communication servers, it could be in email, it could be on the backup disk, it could be in paper. And because companies are not comfortable in knowing where the relevant information, that's where we get into the keep everything legal holds that I talked about. It can be incredibly costly to find this information, to preserve this information, and then eventually to get that information out and get the relevant information to the appropriate party. In many instances I've seen when folks were not able to get out the relevant information, in instances where the other side perhaps had copies of that information, sanctions have arisen. I've seen a small business sanctioned about $40,000 in an instance over half a dozen, maybe a dozen emails. I've seen larger companies sanctioned millions of dollars. So e-discovery is part of that fire for these organizations and why we really need to come up with a solution to deal with big data. I don't really want to talk too much about sanctions, but I do want to talk about e-discovery costs. E-discovery, just the basic going through, getting your information, getting it processed, getting it reviewed by your attorneys, and it is incredibly expensive. And as you see here, the Minnesota Journal of Law, Science, and Technology, they did a study and found it's between $5,000 and $30,000 per gigabyte. And if you remember our perspective slide earlier, a gigabyte was the smallest that we had on there. It was the smallest grouping that we had on that list. There was another article that went into this and delved into this that was called Where the Money Goes, Understanding Litigant Expenditures for Reducing Electronic Discovery. In their analysis, they found that this number is correct, that the total cost per gigabyte reviewed were generally around $18,000, again, per gigabyte. which is, again, the smallest number that we saw on that earlier slide, giving us some perspective on these terminologies that are being thrown at us. But we have to think about this. This doesn't include the cost of preservation. When litigation is reasonably anticipated, a party has a duty, the duty to preserve, which means that they need to keep that data so it is not altered or modified in any way. That, again, can be very, very expensive. But this $18,000 that I'm talking about, or this $5,000 to $30,000, doesn't even include the cost of trying to preserve that. Many times, litigation can go on for years before information is actually collected and turned over to the other side. Then there's always the concept of mystery data, which is our next slide. We rely on our users to keep their information. These user files can be anywhere. Many times you'll find folks that they don't like the limits on their email. So they pull off their emails into PST files and they put them all over their hard drives, or they're actually put them in the file shares. Users are amazing about where they will put things, especially if they don't want other people to see them. I've seen situations where folks used old CDs or DVDs as coasters only to find that there was information on that that may have been relevant to a litigation, that may have been actually important business information. You hear stories all the time about people finding closets full of backup tapes. What do you do with those? And even if you find this mystery data, you obviously don't know what's on it. You may have to have it spin up by our, old technologies. And even if the data doesn't, contain personally identifiable information like Social Security numbers and all these other things, it could be relevant to e-discovery. It could have been important to your business at some time to help you make a better business decision. But because it's this mystery data, you have no idea what's on there. So next is where I want to take the bulk of our conversation. Is we've set it up. This is the smoke. This is what we're seeing. This is the fire. These are the problems that you can find in your organizations that can be caused by this. But here's the important part. What do we do now? How do we cut off the oxygen to this fire so we can make data? If we don't eliminate data, at least make the data controllable. At least something that we know how to deal with. My co-panelist here, Jim, said that he'd never had experienced a webinar that had a Katy Perry quote, but here it is, and I think it's really relevant. Information overload, situation, loss control, send out an SOS. So I always tell people when they say, what I do, is it cool? I always tell them, well, yes, it is, because Katy Perry says so in one of her songs. But I just think that is just an outstanding way of simplifying what we're dealing with in this. So I want to give you the answer to the SOS. This is something that I've come up with index engines. It's on the next slide. And it's a combination of technology and methodology. You have all of this unstructured information that you need to deal with. So what are you going to do? So if Jim, you'll click the next slide, click it again. Index engines have something called data profile. And I'm going to let Jim take over here in just a little bit to talk about that. But you can use the information from this data profile through their technology to answer all sorts of questions about your data. Then comes in the methodology. This is where you use or create all of your policies and procedures. You understand your legal requirements. You show people how to actually file this stuff. And from the methodology, you answer even more questions. And from the methodology, you're actually making decisions about your data. You're making decisions about what to do with it. And in those decisions, you can decide to archive them, to actually retain them. And this is something else that index engines can do. You can just watch it. You can say, hey, look, it's in a good place. We just want to make sure that it stays where it is. You can migrate it. Let's say you find a lot of data that has personally identifiable information and you want to put it someplace more secure. You can actually classify your data and perhaps move things to the right place. And that's all your business information. And that's very powerful because you're actually going to be able to use this information instead of it being that mystery data to you. And the last bucket, which is the largest one, is because you have done the technology and you've answered certain questions, you've gone through the methodology and you're able to apply rules to that information that you've gained, you can go through and get to defensible disposition. And that, again, is where we get to the return on investment, that $171 per gigabyte that you could save per year. So what I'm going to do now is I want to turn it over to Jim so he can tell you more about this data profile that Index Engine offers.
Thanks, Lisa. I should have made you sing that Katy Perry quote, so but we'll let you off the hook today, though.
All right.
I thought it was a nice segue into popular culture. But it's great content, and the statistics that you see out there are basically mind-numbing and overwhelming. And I think a lot of the customers that we deal with in Index Engines, and I know Lisa deals with as well, deal with the analysis paralysis of, where do you begin? And I think, the challenge and the key takeaway from today is, what data profiling allows you to do is to give you insight into your unstructured user data. And unstructured user data is really a lot of where the pain lies, and that includes, email, including PSTs, which are always a painful component of your electronic discovery or legal compliance requirements. And the loose files, which are Word documents, spreadsheets, contracts, agreements, and so on, that are really not managed as well as they need to be managed. So providing that level of insight, it allows you to make decisions about the data, and decisions, if you have a policy in place, those decisions should be fairly straightforward. If you don't have a policy in place, I mean, there's obviously, as Lisa mentioned, methodology consulting services that are key to help flesh out those policies and update them and refine them. And then once you've done that, you can actually take action on the data. And the action that was taken over the past number of years may have been just ignored and just let it sit there because storage is cheap. But in fact, Lisa's told us that storage is not cheap, and that action is really key, including things like migrating it. And you may want to migrate it to something that's less expensive storage. The cloud is one of the more likely targets, or migrate it offline to a not as accessible environment just to keep it safe if people need to get access to it, but keep it out of the clutter of the network. Archiving it, as Lisa mentioned, that's all the intellectual property, the stuff with business value, is securing it and preserving it for long term. Deleting it is becoming more and more popular, and I think organizations have not really deleted data just because why would they? It's just having a unlimited junk drawer in your house. You just fill it up with continual junk, and you look at it every day. You open that junk drawer and you look at it and you say, I know there's stuff in there that I don't need, but why would I throw it away? But I think when push came to shove and you did some spring cleaning, as you're hopefully doing these days, the stuff that's like, you know what, I haven't touched it in years, I'm going to get rid of it. And then watching it, watching data, managing storage or data in place and saying, if there's a trigger event that happens, maybe an e-discovery event against a specific custodian or user, or someone leaves the company, or if the data ages out to a point where no one really sees any value any longer, you can take action on it as well. So I think what data profiling, and I'll show some examples of what we've done, is the ability to provide that level of insight into the data. And as Lisa mentioned, when you start talking petabytes and zettabytes and massive volumes of content, it becomes very difficult to make these decisions. So let technology help you in giving you that insight so you can make bulk decisions about that content. So here's some policies, some data profiling policies that our customers are working with. And the first one, talking about abandoned data. I mean, every network that we've seen has this content on there, and it's, as an example, it's data owned by an ex-employee. And with our technology, we integrate into Active Directory, which allows you to determine which are active or inactive employees. So if you say, show me all the inactive employees, and then data profiling can also trigger off on the dates, like modify date, access date, created date, and so on. So if you say, show me all data owned by ex-employees, that has had no access in, let's say, 3 years. So if no one's touched it in 3 years and it's owned by someone that's no longer with the company, let's classify that as abandoned data. And let's have those conversations with the different departments about what would you like to do about this abandoned content. And obviously, you want to cross-reference that against any legal hold or regulatory hold requirements that you have. But if it passes that filter and it doesn't have any hold requirements, it's officially abandoned data. And there you can work with the different organizations to say, what do we want to do with it? And HR may have a different opinion versus manufacturing or research. So maybe research data that is officially abandoned may have value. So maybe old data, old research that is turned into dark data meaning data that no one really has any idea exists, but may have value to the organization. So this may be a tool to help uncover that stuff. And maybe your research team may want to say, well, show me what that abandoned data is, and using some queries may uncover some stuff that has value. Age data is stuff that has aged out past any business value, and you can use the access key, the access date there as well, so not access to more than 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. Again, you can determine if it does have value, but if it's age data that's owned by someone within the mailroom, obviously that may not have less value to you as something that's owned by someone in research and development. So you can make those decisions. Redundant data, which is duplicate content, data profiling does use MD5 hash algorithm to create a unique document signature for files out there, so you can see that redundant content. And when you're sending a Excel spreadsheet or a Word doc or a presentation to someone and they save it on their desktop, immediately you've got copies of it. You send that out to 10 people, you've got 10 copies. So there's a significant volume of redundant data that exists on user shares and networks, and we see anywhere from 30% to 50% of the content is duplicate data. Personal data, this is one that is becoming more and more an issue for organizations, and it may not have legal implications, although it may, but it definitely has storage implications, and it can take up a significant volume of space. So users, someone comes back from vacation and they take their vacation photos, put it on their desktop, and then send it out to a bunch of people. Someone's downloading movies, maybe copyrighted movies off the internet. Someone's placing their iTunes directory on their desktop. That stuff gets backed up and protected by the IT organization and replicated and copied, and it could take up a lot of space. And if you do an analysis with data profiling and say, show me all iTunes directories, or show me all movies and multimedia files, and find your number, your top dozen or so culprits, you can work with organizations to go clean that stuff up. And there's no reason that an organization should be storing that. It's just taking up valuable space. Risk-based policies, Lisa mentioned e-discovery, but beyond these, and also PI, personally identifiable information, find that content that has that sensitive data and then take the appropriate action. Archive policies, data with long-term business value. And this is really value-based archiving, versus the archive everything strategy. Some organizations are archiving all their email, and that creates a big pile of email that's very difficult to put on legal hold or to search. Whereas you look at the value-based archiving, which is just archiving what has value. And then finally, managing active data, the stuff that's the current stuff that people are working with and using every day. Manage that data in place, and if there's a certain trigger event, if it turns into age data or turns into redundant content or personal data, then take the action from the appropriate policies above. So those are some of the things that data profiling provides, and I think different organizations are interested in different facets, but I mean it's a flexible technology that allows you to really understand how to execute those policies. And I think one of the key challenges that we see with customers is all about methodology, and I think Lisa has a lot of experience there in terms of methodology around how to approach this.
Thanks, Jim. I stuck this slide in here because Jim mentioned policies, and that's kind of my area. So I want to talk with you all a little bit about the methodology to apply in looking at this information you can get from your data profile. And I think the Supreme Court came down with a case, and it's funny, it's the Arthur Anderson case, which most people think about, the data shredding, it was bad. But the court actually said it is of course not wrongful for a manager to instruct his employees to comply with a valid document retention policy under ordinary circumstances. And in that kind of short sentence, I mean, they really summarize the methodology that needs to go into place when you're dealing with this information. Obviously, they said it's not wrongful, so it's okay to follow your organization's rules, but it said you had to have a valid document retention policy. There's got to be some rules in place. You've got to have some policies in place. You need to have some policies around record-keeping requirements because there's lots of statutes and regulations that require you to keep certain documents and records a certain amount of time. But there's also a lot of information that has business value that you need to think about. You know, policies like this information management policy, you know, you're going to answer lots of questions in that policy for folks about ownership, about expectation of privacy, why you're even creating that information, who's responsible for retention, you know, where are you going to store it, protect it, retrieve it, any kind of disposition methods, and then how are you going to stop it if you do get involved with litigation and have a legal hold or have a duty to preserve. And then also you can have some things in place like file plans that really marry the retention schedule being the document that tells you how long you need to keep certain records to satisfy various business, legal, regulatory, compliance requirements. But you marry that to how folks really file. So you're actually allowing people to, you know, do some of this work on the fly rather than having to go back and look at a retention schedule, you know, every time they want to file or store a document. Again, that statement by the Supreme Court, it is of course not wrongful for a manager to instruct his employees to comply with a valid document retention policies under ordinary circumstances being no legal holds, no preservation orders, no duties to preserve. Comply is a big part of that sentence. That people are actually following that policy, your procedures, your schedule, and it's being enforced by the organization. It talks about instructing employees that you actually need to train people. And so that's part of this whole methodology of what you need to put into place. So when you get that information from the data profile, you can answer questions such as, well, hey, how long do we as an organization retain accounts payable information or employee information or, you know, our truck maintenance information? Because you have that already. You've already gone through the work of the methodology, so then you can apply that to the data profile. You can also answer questions about, are there any legal holds in place? And if so, do they apply to this data that we're looking at, to this data profile? You know, how do we dispose of electronically stored information? Because we all know that when you hit the delete on your keyboard, it doesn't really mean delete. So that's something that, you know, you could determine. You could say, this is how we're going to dispose of it, or, you know, we're going to utilize the software to help us with that. It's also going to help you, you know, make determinations about where should we store our information. So when you're looking at this data profile and you're looking at your methodology, you can say, hey, look, this bulk of information that we found over here in this repository, according to our methodology and our rules for our organizations, should really be way over here. And you can make that move to the appropriate archive or wherever else you want to put that information. And so there's a lot of different things with the methodology. I mean, when you go through this whole process and you come up with your policies, your procedures, your schedules and things, that you can apply that. And you can apply that to these data profiles. And that's, you know, that's kind of the sweet spot of what we do here at Information Consulting, is helping folks with that methodology. But it's not just the methodology that solves the problem. It's the combination of the methodology and technology together. It's just got to be that combo. So I really want to turn it back over to Jim, because he's going to show you what knowledge you can really gain from these data profiles.
Thanks, Lisa. I think you know, data profiling is definitely a new space. There's been a lot of data mapping, you know, talk in the past, which has really been a more manual interview-based process. I mean, data profiling just leverages technology to really point to different data sources and produce a scan of that sources. It's a high-speed, very efficient technology that really extracts very rich metadata index of the unstructured user data, as well as email. And for organizations in looking at this, and I think what you're not going to need to do is really index your entire infrastructure. That's a boil the ocean type strategy, is to really focus on where's your pain points. Prioritize certain environments. So for some customers we deal with, it's just user shares. We have customers that have multi-petabyte user shares of just unknown content that exists there, and they're upgrading it with increased storage capacity year after year, whereas they know it's just like there's a lot of garbage in there. So the IT is motivated to clean that up, and that's the beauty of data profiling, is IT gets a lot of benefit from it because there's some cost savings, and the legal and compliance teams are all motivated just to manage that long-term risk and liability. So user shares is one. Departmental servers, maybe HR, maybe manufacturing, maybe sales and marketing, maybe legal, email servers, even legacy backup tapes. We have a lot of customers that are just concerned of the content that exists on those legacy environments. So kind of pick and choose your battles. The key strategy with any information governance program is to start small, start with high profile, high pain areas, but start and don't spend 5 years developing a strategy and just never get started. Then once you pick up those sources, scanning those environments will extract the metadata. Some of the key metadata fields are obviously dates. Last modified or access dates are very, very important dates from data profiling point of view. That helps to determine business value. Now, obviously, if it hasn't been accessed in years, does it have value? Not, most of the time, no, but sometimes it may have value. People may have lost it, and that can be referred to as dark data, data with value that's just lost within the infrastructure. So I think, this gives you a good indication of, definitely no one knows it exists, no one's getting access to it. Does it have value? Should it be retained or not? It is another question. User information, who the author is, location and path. The more important point here is the size of the data. That's showing how much space is taking up. And if you're pointing to backup data, you can get some backup information as well. But this information is going to extract, file and email metadata into a searchable database. And then the real power of data profiling is that you can combine queries and filters on this metadata repository to make decisions. So you can point to a specific folder within a server, for example, maybe the documents folder within the HR server, and say I just want to point to that and find out if there's any data owned by ex-employees and see what's happening with that. Or you can do the entire server. So it's a lot of flexibility of creating filters and then queries and reports on top of that, which I'll show you in a second, in order to determine and make these disposition decisions. So some of the metadata that is available through data profiling is dates, as I mentioned, the modified and last, last access date are key. Size is very important, obviously, how much space is taking. The file name, the owner is very important of that. And the MD5 signature, is used for deduplication decisions. And it's done on user files, it's done on emails as well. So email for data profiling needs to be done at a full content view versus the metadata only view. So that's one of the options in the data profiling platform, is you can just say high level index, which is the metadata only. So for email, it's just going to get you a repository like a PST, Exchange database, or a Notes database. If you do full content, it's going to go inside there and do the full text on emails and attachments. For email, it's required. So you can do those type of, these are a sample of some of the metadata output that's available. So you can start asking questions to the system, like what data has not been accessed in more than 7 years. And some of our clients are doing more than 3 years is a date of, the age of when data has been basically abandoned or aged out. So, but you do have a lot of data on your network, I can guarantee you, that hasn't been accessed in 7 years. What data is owned by ex-employee? Again, we can integrate to Active Directory, which is really the environment that manages all the permission schemas throughout your network. And it has the notion of active versus inactive employees. So if you look at inactive employees in Active Directory, you can say how much data is owned by inactive employees, for example. Where's John Doe's email? So simple question, it's going to be in the email server, obviously, but what about PSTs? What about email that's saved as EML or MSG files on desktops or in folders, and so on? So email is not just in one location anymore. It can be scattered throughout the infrastructure, And a data profile is a great tool for e-discovery challenges in the identification of data, so asking it where is this information because they have a new pending lawsuit, and it'll tell you exactly where that stuff is to streamline and manage the costs associated with the identification and collection of that content. And then why am I archiving data to tape that's more than 10 years old? And I think this is, again, another IT benefit that, where IT is backing up data off the network and they're doing a full backup every week. They're backing up stuff that's owned by ex-employees that hasn't been accessed in 10 years, that's redundant, duplicate content. Why are they doing that? So to be able to streamline their processes, there's, again, a win-win for them as well. What percentage of data is duplicate? I mean, duplicate data represents anywhere from 20 to 40% of what exists on networks. There's a lot of it. So what percent is duplicate? Who owns it? What departments own it? And I think, some of the successful implementations we've seen of data profiling is when your IT organization implements this, they can go back, and if they're doing chargebacks to different divisions, so they're doing a chargeback to HR, chargeback to research, or chargeback to manufacturing for the storage or data center usage, they can go back and say, you know what, you're being charged 40% of that server, and by the way, 60% of the data on that server that you're storing has not been accessed in more than 7 years. Can we talk about that and have a conversation? And I think data profiling is a great tool to have a conversation about content. So there's a bunch of dynamic reports. I'll show you a sample in a second that really combines filters and queries with summary reports that you can look at things like age data, as I mentioned. So you could definitely point to a user share or a specific server, say nothing accessed in more than 5 years. And here a strategy could be move it to some location like a cloud environment, which is a cheaper storage repository. Looking for ex-employee data, you can query by owner names or inactive employees, say ex-employee data that hasn't been accessed in 7 years. Can you defensively delete that? Is that a strategy that you can execute within your organization? Again, all policies differ among organizations, but a lot of firms are really going through that defensible deletion process. In fact, we work with a client on data profiling that 100 terabyte server, which is a significant volume of content, billions and billions of files and emails and so on. He did a data profile on his server and found that of the 100 terabytes, a significant portion was duplicate, a significant portion was abandoned and aged data, a significant portion had no business value, and found that only 20 terabytes, or 20% of that server, had anything that was business value. So he was able to reclaim 80 terabytes of storage, which made him happy because he didn't have to upgrade or buy new storage. But he got rid of a lot of just mystery data that had potential liability hidden in there and deleted that. And that was all done defensively with the blessing of the powers that be within the legal and compliance team. Looking at departmental data, for example, an HR server, so you can filter down to a specific server. You can query project keywords and then archive data that has value. This is doing a full content metadata, full content data profile. Looking for multimedia files I mentioned earlier, things like iTunes libraries. Take the top culprits by owner and capacity, and then notify their manager that this stuff needs to be removed from the network. PII, sensitive content like social security numbers, credit card numbers, you can query on that, find the owners and location of that data, and use encryption algorithms to do that. Managing PSTs, locate the PSTs throughout the network, find who owns them when they were last accessed, and then put together a management strategy for that content. So we do have customers that have policies that have locked down PSTs from being created by users. We've done policy audits using a data profile on their servers, and lo and behold, found about 14,000 PSTs on their network. So with that client, they were very interested in being able to understand that, audit the policy, and then they reworked their policy, worked with IT to make sure it was being implemented correctly. So here's an example of some screenshots of the interface. So this workflow is looking at age data. Again, you can do a filter based on specific locations. So you can see here there's some specific check marks of servers checked here. So you can specify any locations by department or by server or by directory, whatever you're choosing. And you can get a summary report. In this case, this is a modified summary report, so last modified. It could be last accessed as well. And here we see that a bulk of the data has not been accessed or modified in 5 years. And you can see the volume of it. So here it happens to be 57 gigabytes, which is not large in the scheme of things. That could be 57 terabytes, which is large in the scheme of things. So what you can do is you can go and click, and the nice thing about data profiling is these reports are active reports. So you see here I can uncheck everything except for the greater than 5 years, which I've done here. So you can see only greater than 5 years is checked. So it's filtered down to that quantity. Then I can run another subsequent report that says who owns this stuff. And then here you can see of the stuff that hasn't been modified in 5 years, 63% is owned by this individual here. And you can determine is that a current employee or an active or inactive employee on the network, and then make decisions about the content. So, I mean, I think, let me back up one more thing. So within the data profiling tool, there's disposition functionality that will allow you to take action on the data, whether you want to delete it. And in the deletion process, it's all logged. So the user that's logged into the tool, the data profiling tool, is tracked. So if you delete, a terabyte of data on June 15th, 2012, it'll log it saying, John Doe logged into the system on June 2012 and deleted these specific files. So it's all logged in defensible process. So I think the key here in terms of data profiling is really to provide you the insight and the knowledge of the content that exists, so you could work with the appropriate teams within the organization to make these disposition decisions about the content. So again, going back to our theme, where there's smoke, there's fire. I mean, there's definitely, smoke on your network. To be able to avoid having a fire is really to attack this big data and to make some decisions about it. And what I'll do is pass it back to Lisa to wrap this up and take any questions if you have them.
Sorry about that. I muted myself there for a second. Jim, I just did some real quick math, and math is not my strong subject, I will admit that. But you were talking about the one client who had the large terabytes, and you were able to get rid of about 80% or 80 terabytes. You take
Right.
that times my research of the $171,000 $171,000 per terabyte, and I just did real math. That's like $13 million. I mean, to me, that's just stunning when you kind of put the pen to the paper on this stuff.
There is tremendous cost savings, and I think the challenge in getting this technology implemented is that the IT organizations are strapped and their budgets are tight as well. But if you can show an advantage to them that they could reclaim some of this capacity, reclaim some of this network environment, and stop from backing it up, and all these advantages, you can get their attention. So I think part of the challenge of records managers and information governance professionals is getting the attention of IT to help implement this stuff, and there's a win-win here. So I think there's definitely advantages on both sides.
Yeah, it's a great way to get rid of what I call low-hanging fruit. Your duplicates, your abandons, your personal. I mean, it just adds up. It's amazing how much it does. Our conclusion is, obviously, we've talked about the smoke, which is big data. We've talked about the fire, as how costly it can be, both with storage, e-discovery, mystery data, all that good stuff. And I think we've given you a great way to cut that off, to cut off the oxygen to that fire, and at least, if not totally get rid of the fire, at least make it a controlled burn. I really think that it's a combination of methodology and technology. And as many of you that are out there who know me know that I have talked for years about some way to deal with this blob of data, blob of information that everybody has out there on their networks, and how to clean that up so then we can apply the methodology going forward to try to not let that happen again, or as Jim said, use the technology to do some basic audits to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Jim and I, before we take some questions here, we have a couple of offers, and Jim will go to the next slide. It's all my contact information. Please follow me on Twitter, all that good stuff. I'm on LinkedIn. If you ever have any questions, email me or call me. I'm a big believer that nowadays we're also short on time, that we really don't have any time to read long books regarding all of this information that's out there on big data and storage and all that good stuff, and anything revolving information governance. So what I've done is I worked with a graphic designer and I created some infographics And most of the beginning slides were actually pieces of those infographics. I want to let you know that those are out on my website. You can go under free resources or under the blog and find those. Under the blog, you're going to find an embedded code. So if you want to use those on your organizational, your website, or you have some kind of an electronic newsletter for your organization, or perhaps some group that you belong to and you want to use those are out there. Please feel free. I built those, like I said, those infographics to spread knowledge as quickly as possible, where somebody can take a glance and read just a little bit and get a good idea about what's going on out there in the world. I think they're good for explaining different concepts, perhaps to bosses and C-level folks about what's going on. I do have those in paper format. And I do charge a little bit for those to handle printing and shipping, but if you're interested in those, you can go on my website and find those as well. But in electronic format, they are free to use. Please, please take advantage of them. I think they provide some great information. I'm going to turn it over to Jim again.
Yeah, and we also have a white paper available talking about achieving effective information governance through data profiling. My email address is on the page there. You can just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send that to you. And I think either you can send an email to either Lisa or myself, and we'd be happy to send you a copy of the slides. We've also recorded today's webinar too, so we will put it up online, and if you're interested in the link to that, just ask and we can send that as well. Lisa, there's a question that came in from the audience about, can you briefly go over how you got the numbers on the cost savings once again? How did you come up with that number?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
And actually, if you'll actually go to that infographic on my website, I actually have the citations to the places that I looked at to find that information. One was a particular website that talked about data, and I think they said it was $25 per month per gigabyte. And that was kind of the largest number I found. But I also found a number of sites where IT folks were talking amongst themselves and trying to figure out what the total cost of ownership for storage was. And through that, the numbers I gleaned there, I just did a simple average to come up with $171 per gigabyte. But again, if you'll go to my website, you can pull off an electronic copy of it's called Reduced Data, Reduced Storage Cost. Infographic. It will have the citations to where I found that information, and again, it was just a simple average after I came up with that information.
Okay. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. I know we're a little bit past our time, so.
I think we have one, which is, I have a small business. Are the big data issues different? And if so, is the solution different? And,
I think big data, every company, big data is really tied to how long you've been in business, because it's stuff that ages out on the network and stay there. But we have customers that we work with that they're struggling with big data challenges, and they only have, a couple of terabytes of data. And you can go to Best Buy and buy a couple terabytes hard drive for your home use, but having a couple terabytes, the stuff that's hidden in there could be very sensitive stuff when a lawsuit, rears its ugly head. So, big data comes in small terabytes to massive petabytes and zettabytes. So I think it's across the board. The question that you need to ask, is, do you have a policy, an information management policy, that's going to protect you from any kind of liabilities down the road, correct?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think even for small businesses, you run into that tipping point where you have too much information and data and you're not sure what you need to do. So really the methodology and the technology, I think, are applicable in any, for small business, for medium business, and for large businesses, because I have worked with several small businesses that had an incredible amount of information that was incredibly important to the livelihood of their business, logistic companies and whatnot. So it really depends upon what type of business you have, but again, I think every company has that tipping point where they need to start making some decisions about what they need to do with all of that information, even for the reasons that Jim just said, when you get into litigation or you deal with personally identifiable information and all that good stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa. I really enjoyed doing the presentation with you today, and your contact information is on the screen. My contact information on the screen now. So if you do have any questions or want any of this information we discussed, please feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to speaking with you all in the future. Thanks again, Lisa.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.